Okay, welcome everybody to episode 3. I'm joined today by Paul McGregor, the founder of Alberta 51 project. And as we look into how Alberta is now going to be more than likely heading for independence, we realize that we cannot stand on our own for more than maybe 2 years. And Paul has kind of laid out a map and a pathway to transition from that independence period to becoming a state, or the 51st state. So, Paul, let's get into kind of where this idea started.
Yeah, actually, going back, Mike, many years, I mean, decades, I'd always considered, in the back of my head, that inevitably at some point, Canada or part of Canada would become part of the USA. I think anybody who looks into kind of a futuristic viewpoint would say, look, it's inevitable at some point. And then about 4 or 5 years ago, things started to change. We started to see, and I'm going back even more than longer than that, to the Obama years and everything. Could tell that things on the political landscape, probably starting with Obama, really started to change. And then they changed before then, of course, but you started to see effects in culture by the government and pushing and leading down this way that the people didn't want, but they were being convinced that the woke, the cancel culture people, right? And they started to go down this, and whatever happens in the States trickles down to Canada eventually. We're behind it, but it'll trickle down. And that's media, that's Hollywood, whatever the case might be, right? We're very closely tied in the culture in that way. And then when Trudeau came in and we started to see the dictatorial way he was ruling, I started to realize at that point that the system, the governing system in Canada, is set up for a dictator to take charge. And this, I think a lot of people don't understand this, that we are in a supreme rulership system.
Mm-hmm.
You can look that right up on the Government of Canada website. It's not something I'm making up. It's not my opinion.
It's not.
It is, right? So, and the way a supreme rulership works is that ultimately there is one person who's in charge who says, I'm going to rule, not govern, but I'm the ruler of said nation. And of course, this is what 1776, this is what happened in the States, and the Americans said, forget it. They'd gotten a taste of freedom and so on and so forth. I think the spirit of Alberta, the people of Alberta, is that we cherish freedom. We're outdoors. We have this rancher cowboy.
Always had. I mean, our sign coming into Alberta is Wild Rose Country.
Exactly.
It's not welcome to communism.
Yeah, and I think we've always been fiscally conservative in Alberta, because it was kind of like, stay out of my life and stay out of my pocket.
Yeah.
Okay, here's the government, but we don't want you in our life. I started to see that, governmentally speaking, in Canada, it was becoming the stark contrast between Eastern Canada and the West was becoming. There was no gray line. It was just thickening black line. I mean, there was such a difference. I mean, culturally, we know there's a difference. You pass that, you can drive from Ontario to the West, and as soon as you pass that Manitoba border, everything's different.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, you can feel it, you can sense it in the people, the way they talk, the way they act. It's different.
Yeah, I noticed that when I first moved across the country, because as soon as I left Manitoba and into Saskatchewan, and this was during the scamdemic.
Yeah.
And you go from everyone's wearing masks, everyone's 6 feet apart, all of a sudden, nobody's wearing a mask, everything's open, everything's free.
Yeah.
And it's like, what?
And we fought against that, right? We fought against that. Then we get down to the truckers, right? Well, before all of this, I started to see the writing, the proverbial writing on the wall, and saying, okay, you know what? Politically, things are going to change. Looked at the geopolitical and geoeconomical situations, and I said, there's something changing here. and the lines are being drawn a lot. There's less gray, and there's a battle going on between globalism and nationalism, and I could see that. Inevitably, looking at it, I thought, looking at this all over the years, I thought we will become part of the US, or there will be some sort of war if someone takes over Canada. And then we see this with the Chinese influence of Canada,
Yes.
brought in by Trudeau right off the bat. You know, he's an admirer of the
Basic
CCP,
dictatorship.
basic dictatorship, because he could control the economy, interestingly enough. So, and then of course his rule after that followed exactly what he had said. It wasn't a surprise. People, I hear people, well, yeah, well, couldn't believe it. You know, this dude, he said it from day one.
Yeah.
In his campaign, he said,
Yeah.
right? As soon as you see, so without getting into all the governmental affairs, we could see geopolitically that the big players, especially China, was trying to take over the U.S. as being with the UN as being the world power. And of course, you knew that was going to come to a clash at some point or another. Just think about it. And of course, it has at this point. So, without getting too much into the weeds, because that's where we're going at this point, is inevitably, economically, geopolitically, we would have a choice. And the choice is clear now. I think anybody who really looks at it will see that it is between Chinese control of Canada or US control of Canada. There's Canada, and I don't know, people are sentimental, and I get it. You know, the sentimental about old Canada and so on and so forth, because you were brought up that way. But we have to understand that all governing systems are economic relationships. You have to have, especially when you have different governments, whether it's provinces or states or countries. State is a country anyway, for those of you who don't know. But you have, what you do is you start to make economic unions so you can survive, because you can't survive on your own.
Right.
And this is the problem with Alberta independence without statehood, right?
Yes.
So and you had mentioned it earlier, is that's the whole problem. Now, I hear a lot of opinions out there, and they're interesting, but they assume an economic union with somebody uninhibited. It's not going to happen in the way they think it's going to happen, simply because you just have to think it through. But anyway, I want to get away from the sentimentality. You had asked me when this started. So several years ago, when I saw this stuff, I said, you know what? Alberta's going to go at some point, and it's closer now than ever. And we're going back 4 or 5 years ago. Um, and so I said, what we need to do is we need to educate people on how and why we should become a state rather than independent. Okay. And so there was nothing out there. There's a lot of statehood people, you know, it just kind of all over the place.
Yeah.
But I wanted to make a home where people could learn on the reasons why, and give them some in-depth information. I'd love to have a team to do more work on this, but what we did was we got together with a whole bunch of people. There was 13 of us, got together and went through what would an Alberta Constitution look like? Why should we become a US state? What is the problem with Canada's governing system? You know, we went through all those things, and that becomes part of that platform that we have on ab51project.com. And so we put that together so people could educate themselves, and then we could start the conversation. That's how things start.
Yes.
You have to have the conversation. We just need people to, as you've said before, just listen to them. We'll listen to us and consider it. Right now, there has been a massive media propaganda campaign, I'm going to say, that was, as I said earlier off camera to you, that was one of the most impressive propaganda campaigns I've ever seen in my lifetime.
It was a psyop.
It was. So you've got paid media that are paid almost $1 billion a year who carry water for the Liberal government. We've gone through the COVID, the trucker convoy, and so on and so forth. People understood, especially in the West, um, that our freedoms were taken away from us. It is interesting to note that, and I hear people saying this back east. Well, what rights did you lose? What freedoms did you lose? And it's
There's a
interesting to me. There is, but you know what's interesting, Mike, is that they're not aware of a loss of freedom because they've already lost it decades
yes,
before, and they're
exactly.
oblivious to the fact that to them, this is the way the government works, right? And we have Eastern Canada from a governing standpoint, which is a welfare system was passed out, and that welfare system needed money to support it. Hence the West and Alberta. And that goes back to, a lot of people say, well, they're treating us bad. Listen, the whole thing was designed that way to begin with. Clifford Sifton, he was part of the Canadian government, the Dominion of Canada at the time, back in 1904, when they created the Western provinces, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and the territories, said, we want these lands or these peoples, these provinces to enrich Upper and Lower Canada, which were Ontario and Quebec, and by extension, Eastern Canada.
Yeah.
That's the way it was designed, and that's the way it's operating.
And it's still that way.
And it's still that way. And it's going to always be that way because the way you have a welfare state that is designed, that needs money input. You have a Quebec province that has sealed off all its resources, capped them so that they're not using them. They're storing them up for a day in the future. That they're the equalization payments, when you talk about the formula of the equalization payments, because the equalization is that wealth transfer. That's what it is, right?
That's exactly
so you wealth transfer over to whomever you decide, right? Well, part of the equalization formula is that hydro cannot be included as a resource or monetary input into that province. So that Quebec, when you take out its largest resource, and they have not developed the other resources on purpose, their oil, their minerals, and they've got massive resources. They've kept them down. And so what happens is they always look like a have-not province, which is hilarious to anyone who's got half a brain cell operating, right? Like, come on. So they do that, and the wealth transfers over there. And they realize that, and you have to go back in time where you have Upper and Lower Canada, that there was always a rulership issue. Quebec wanted to be the rulers, Ontario wanted to be the rulers, and Ottawa, being on the border, was chosen by the Queen to be the capital of Canada. And that way it's kind of half and half, right?
And geographically, that still doesn't make any sense.
No.
Because you could even go into Manitoba where they have the longitudinal center of Canada. Well, there's your capital.
No.
That's dead center.
Well,
now, at least
if you want to talk about, doesn't make any sense. I mean, look, this whole thing is Upper and Lower Canada, had a lot of money, right?
Yeah.
BC got into Confederation because they were going bankrupt. Didn't like the Southern Christians, the way they were treating the Catholics at the time, and said, oops, we're not going to go to the States. What we're going to do is we're going to see if Canada can bail us out. And, then that way we won't have an issue with a majority Catholic population. And Canada said, no problem. And by the way, we'll just literally railroad through Rupert's Land and claim it as our own. And then we'll create provinces. We'll put a railroad there and connect you to the east. British Columbia said, fantastic. You talk about the founding of the Confederation of Canada. PEI was in financial problems. Nova Scotia was in financial problems. They started to get together. What are we going to do? Well, lo and behold, Upper and Lower Canada hears about it and says, hey, can we join your little meeting? And they did. And then they said, well, listen, guys, if you become part of Confederation, we'll get you out of your financial problems. And of course they agreed because they were going bankrupt. They had no choice, right? So when you talk about Canada, the issue behind the creation of Canada is an economic union, right?
Yeah.
The West was uh, how you want to appropriate it. It was taken. It was whatever language you want to use. These were not people that were asked, "Do you want to become part of Canada?" Okay, let's put it that way.
They were invaded, to say
They were
least.
they were just taken over. Boom, right? And they and the British government paid off the Hudson's Bay Company, which is going out of business, I hear. But anyway, that's another story.
Bankruptcy.
Yeah. So, but they paid them off and said, "Hey, sell us the land." Hudson's Bay Company says, "Well, we don't own the land. The people own the land."
Yeah.
But they said, "Listen, you're going to sell it to us. Why?" "Well, you're part of the British government. We're the ruler. I'm the king, and I'm telling you, you're going to sell it to me." "Okay, shoot, I'll sell it to you." The people were like, "Well, wait a minute. You didn't even ask us. There was no vote. There was no democracy about it." So when you come to Western Canada, it's kind of an interesting thing that's happened there. Part of it is native peoples, the cowboy, the old cowboys and Indians kind of deal, the ranchers, oil people. They have a real freedom desire kind of
Yes.
in their bones, right? You can't change that.
No. And you never will.
You never will. So when I started to see that, I said, I can see what's going on politically. I can see how the pattern's going. It's going to happen. So about 4 years ago, we started that 4 or 5 years ago. And that was the purpose, to educate people, because I realized what we have here is we have to have information so people can consider that offsets the mainstream media that is paid by the government. Like, people got to understand that whatever CTV Global and CBC are saying, um, they're paid to say that.
Yeah.
Now, the CBC and CTV and Global do not want to have a 51st state type setup where they're going to lose all their funding. And believe me, that'll put some of them out of business. Okay.
Probably all of them.
And there's a lot of people, when it comes down to the 51st state, as you well know, who do not want to talk about statehood because they have monopolies on businesses and they don't want the US competition, right? Competition is good for the people, but it's not good for the guy who owns all the business. So there's that element out there, and you have a lot of opposition. So what we wanted to do was say, this should be about we the people. Go back to the founding roots of the American system. Show that a republican systems, a lot of people don't understand the difference between Canadian governing system and a republic. They don't have a clue.
I think there has to be a separate episode on that, because with that we should be there all day.
Absolutely. So that is a big thing. So once you establish that they're not the same and you can't do the same things and so on and so forth, then what you need to do is you need to look at the positives. So bringing it down to simple terms, really, I'll get into the fact of, you asked about a path. So there are different paths, and most people talk about paths. It's their own opinion on what's going on. There's a lot of things. I think anybody who needs to realize that there's a lot of things going on in the background that none of us really knows what's going on. Okay. But the fact of the matter is, the Clarity Act is designed to not have a province separate. Okay. First off, it's designed to be a failure. So then the question is, for independence purists who think, "Oh, I really want independence," and you may be following someone who's taken you down a path of failure on purpose. When you talk about the Clarity Act, it's a majority clear question, but the majority amount is never determined in the act. So we say 50 plus one. From an international legal standpoint, 50 plus one is legal. It would be recognized by the US as well. Okay. But when it comes to the Clarity Act, they might say, "Well, no, we think it should be 60 or 75%, right?" You will only find out once your referendum happens, and all of a sudden they say, well, that doesn't meet the standard of the Clarity Act. Why? Because the Clarity Act is set up where the rulers are making the decisions after the fact, which is really convenient. So the second thing is that Parliament and all the provinces have to agree. You start to get into that bringing in all the different parties and saying, well, we all have to have a more majority agreement on this. Okay. Then you get into, well, if we do allow it, you'll have to pay so much. And I've heard folks with the independence movement, APP, and so on and so forth. Well, they'll say, well, they owe us money, so that'll go away. Look, that's just an opinion. You don't know that. Okay. So the danger there, of course, is that's what I call wishful thinking, right?
Yeah.
You think that, oh, well, they should offset it. Can I tell you, knowing the Canadian government and how they've operated, that they're never going to let you get away with that way? It'll never be okay, we're clear and free. That's not going to happen.
No.
The issue that we've got is that Alberta, although suppressed, is such an economic powerhouse.
We drive the Canadian economy.
We do.
Almost 100%.
Now, and some folks are going to disagree with us on that, Mike.
Yeah.
They're going to say, well, wait a second. The manufacturers in Ontario and Quebec's got hydro and fisheries and okay. If that's the truth, then you shouldn't have a problem with Alberta going at all.
Exactly.
Okay, but I'll tell you what. It's going to be a huge fuss, if I can use just such a small term. Okay, such a minor terminology. It's going to be huge fuss of Alberta leaving. They're not going to want that cash cow that's been designed that way since back in 1904 to go away. For us, and so when you start to go down the Clarity Act route, talking about paths again and get back into the path, is the Clarity Act route is easily infiltrated by those who do not want you to separate. That's the danger. Okay. Yes. And I mean, that's the fact. So the power is all in the Canadian government's hands to allow you to leave. So for us as staters, we think that's a ridiculous way of going down that route. Now, that route, they say, well, we have to get independence first. The reason they say we have to get independence first, or possibly can say that we have to get independence first, is because it's designed to fail. So they say, well, you know what? We did what we could. Yeah. When we talk about AB 51 as an American union, economic union, and if I didn't say it before, Canada is an economic union except for the West. That's all it's about.
Yes.
Right? So that's from its very beginnings. People are going bankrupt. Upper Canada, Lower Canada, Dominion of Canada, bail us out. And yep, as long as you sign on to Confederation. All except the West. Right?
Yeah.
So we're talking about economic unions. This doesn't change who you are as a people. It's like I tell people, they say, well, we're Canada. Well, listen, you'll still be able to say, how's it going, eh? You'll still be able to,
the culture won't change.
The culture's not going to change any more than it has. We'll still produce the best hockey players on the planet. I mean, there's just that's not going to not happen, right?
But even to say that, are we still producing the best hockey players? The U.S. in recent years have bested Canada on every World Series.
Well, I get it, but most of those, I suppose that when you're talking about Olympics and World Cups, okay, fair enough. But the fact of the matter is, people are worrying about things that are silly.
Yes.
Really, what's important? Well, what's important is my children, my grandchildren, my current livelihood, and so on and so forth. We see a government that, through its governing system, understand, we're not saying that the Canadian people are broken. What we're saying is the government system is broken, and you can't fix it.
Yeah.
everybody starts to say that, well, you know what, if we put the right guy in power, and this is the thing with Pierre Poilievre, and saying, well, if we put Pierre Poilievre in there, he's going to save the world. Rah, rah, rah. Listen, the system is broken. The Senate is 90% liberals. The judiciary is 95% liberals. Even if the liberals aren't in power, the liberals are in power, which is why we've got this travesty of justice going on with the Chris Barber and Tamara Leach, and the government going after them over mischief. And they're asking for 10 years, and they're threatening. They seize people's bank accounts and so on and so forth. This is a ridiculous thing. It proves that the system is broken. So it doesn't matter who's in power. Even the things that were done in Alberta during COVID, Daniel Smith hasn't been able to override it.
No.
The system was after the Coots boys down in Lethbridge, and they ran shot it over them, right? They're in jail. They had to agree to be criminals and be charged. It's a ridiculous system. It was, and so we need, what we need to do is we need to understand that we have a broken system. The system can't work. So when you have a Republican system, there's great advantages, of course, to that, because there's self-healing mechanisms. There's mechanisms that where you may have a bad team of rulers at one point, or governing people at one point, but the fact that every 2, 6, 4, and 6 years you have these elections to be able to correct that. That's why election integrity is so important, of course, right? Is that you can correct it, because the people can say, listen, that guy was a lion snake that I put in there. Next time he's out of there. You have term limits. You have different things that even one can offset the other. You have a elected judiciary, elected Senate, elected House, if you will, Senate and Congress, elected president. You have all these things to offset and try to, and you can, things will self-correct over time.
And with that too, I think one thing people don't really understand is with the Electoral College and the way things operate in the US, it was always built and designed for a certain level of gridlock. So it's never going to have a perfect outcome. You're never going to have that, just because it wasn't designed to have a perfect outcome. But it was designed to give a voice to just about every American.
Absolutely.
And that's what I think, even in Alberta, the ones who are more Team Canada and the ones who don't see the failures of the system here realize that even though, yes, you get to vote in elections across the country, we've seen it year after year. It's been decided before the West even gets their votes in.
So a lot of people don't understand that system is designed, that Eastern Canada, I believe they have 237 seats. I mean, correct me, I'm maybe off, plus minus. And then we have maybe 107, I think, or 112
divided between the prairies.
In the prairies. So and understand that. Well, and that goes back to that cultural divide between Ontario border and the Manitoba border, where the culture in the West is different than the culture in the East. People in the East think we're just crying and whining, and because this is what they want. This is what they're used to. They're used to that British kind of rulership system, and we're out here going, the heck with that, right? I want freedom. I want my guns. People back there go, you're crazy. You people are horrible. You know, you're white supremacists, or whatever the case may. I mean, the slander or the name calling goes all over the place as soon as you get someone from the left who disagrees with you politically. So,
and I grew up with that.
Yeah,
I grew up the first quarter of my life in Ontario, and it dawned on me more when COVID hit, because people out there, it was, you're going to do this. Okay. Yep. They just fell in line and went with it. And anyone who went against it, who said, this is bigger, they're making this bigger than it needs to be. Looked at it as crazy. I got kicked out of grocery stores, out of banks, out of everything.
Well, you were probably a white supremacist racist.
That's exactly.
Okay. So,
and by the time 2021 hit, after putting up with it for a year, even though they said 2 weeks, right? After a year, I said, you know what? Alberta's open. Alberta's free. I'm out.
It's
And
funny that you thought that way. So even in the East, people, right? And I know I get a lot of feedback on our X account about people from the East going, I'm going to move to Alberta. They can recognize intuitively the difference.
yeah,
And they something hits them and they go, something's not right here. And of course, that is at the crux of Alberta and the West is that feeling. And when getting back to methodologies, as staters, we do not trust or believe that the Clarity Act is the way to go at all. In fact, we believed it's designed to waste years. Even I just saw an article on CTV and they said, even if you went down the Clarity Act, it would be years, maybe even a decade before anything would be realized. Okay.
and maybe they put it that way as a deterrent as well.
Exactly. That's exactly what the intent was, to deter you from separate. Oh, it'll probably never happen, but it's designed to not happen. So those who fall in line with that, and I understand, you got lawyers are saying, well, I look at the law and here's what's going on. The problem is, I think what needs to happen is those lawyers and constitutional lawyers, and there are some out there that are really good, that know the difference. When you had Canada as a whole, after the Statute of Westminster in 1931, what happened is that all of the provinces were released from being part of Britain or a colony of Britain. They were independent. They were made independent. You can look this up. It's there. Okay. So it's not really a matter of interpretation. Just read English and it's there.
Yeah.
Okay. So Alberta, and I think the MLA, I think it was cool. I wrote it down, or I printed it out rather. I think it was an Alberta MLA in 1976 had written a letter to René Lévesque, and he had said, look, the Statute of Westminster releases you don't need to separate from Canada. You can have a referendum as a sovereign province.
Yeah.
Okay. And I don't know if you can even call them a province at that point. It's almost a state. But you can declare independence and you can go whatever way you want, right? So we know that was in the Statute of Westminster. We know that people with legal understanding agree on that. The fact that people aren't pursuing it is interesting. So you kind of wonder, is this an infiltrated operation to say, let's go, but we'll make it so difficult that the whole independence thing will go away, aka Quebec.
Yeah.
Right. So is the independence the worry of staters is the independence movement in Alberta, Quebec 2.0. Right.
And that's how they look at it. And I've seen that before too, because Quebec, while having kind of the right mentality behind what they wanted, wasn't perfect because they wanted to keep certain perks of the Canadian system, which is why they are by their own definition, a sovereign nation within a nation. Which
Quebec knows where its bread is buttered. It knows it's rich doing the how they're ruling right now. They have as much say as Ontario over Canada.
Yeah.
And they don't want to let that go because you know what? The rulers are making money off of this whole system, right? You know as well as I do is if you want to find out where the problem is in society, follow the money. You'll find out where the problem is. So
and that happened during COVID. I hate to keep bringing it back because people kept saying trust the science or follow the science.
Yeah.
But here's the thing: when I followed the science, it led to a dead end. When I followed the money, I found the science.
Yeah. That's exactly what it was. Exactly well put. So what the path that we can go down, and I know some people have been putting off this propaganda that if we as a sovereign province or a sovereign state right now, according to the statute of 1931 Statute of Westminster, we could have a referendum and will determine. We have the ability to self-determination at that point in time.
Yeah.
The fact that anybody wants to get into this pigs in a mud pen with Canada fighting back and forth, they love that. They'd love to drag you into that. What we're saying is you don't need to go down. So you could have a referendum is absolutely necessary. It's 50 plus one, no more, no less. Okay. If you have more, great, but it doesn't matter because international law, including the United States Congress, has already said we recognize 50.1 as a mandate. Okay. Yeah. So we go down that route. We could have, we could immediately go to the U.S. Congress based on the Declaration of Independence that any Canadian province it could join the U.S. and they wouldn't even have to. They don't have to go through what the rest of the world goes through. Okay, they could just go to Congress. It's still on the law. It's still on the books. People say, "Well, it's old." Well, so is the Declaration of Independence. It doesn't matter. Yeah. It's part of the law, and it has never been taken out of law. So we could immediately go and say, "Hey, we'd like to become our own state." What does that do? Well, we get a republic that the independents want right away. We have a republic. Why? Because we're joining a republican system that has all the designs that we need to have into it.
Exactly.
Secondly, we have our own constitution made in Alberta. People say, well, what about my health care? What about the health care? We're in Alberta. We make our own health care. When you start to take off all the taxes and the equalization that go to Canada, you're going to have more than enough money. And not only that, what we're saying is we would get rid of income tax because we don't need it. We could have a simple, and I know some people, oh, well, it's, we could have a luxury tax. In other words, no one pays taxes on basic needs. You all need a car. You don't pay taxes up to certain, but if you want to buy a Bentley, you're going to pay taxes. Why? Because you can afford it.
Yeah.
So, and I'm not being communist at that point. What I'm saying is that you give the guy at the bottom a chance to be able to get off his feet, to get up there. Exactly. And you know what? I started off getting my clothes from Sally Ann's. Okay. Many nights, weeks, days, we didn't have any food to eat. All right. Back before there was food banks kind of deal. And what I looked at that is I decided I wasn't going to be a poor victim and I was going to make something of myself and become a success. Anybody can do that. Mm-hmm. But if you're going to hold the people down, I heard, I think another thing about taxes is I heard Ron DeSantis speaking this morning, I think it was a few days ago, but saying that there shouldn't be such a thing as property tax.
And I just shared that on my Instagram too.
I think that's a brilliant idea. I think it goes to the freedom that we could have in Alberta. We could have a heritage fund where we can have an elected board. These things are all in our platform on the site, and a heritage fund where we have an elected board as separate from the government, where things are properly invested, where they report to the people. The issue is that we, the people, can self-govern. I know people talk about indigenous voices. Listen, I'm Treaty Indian, okay? The fact of the matter is, the only people who don't like this is the people that are getting
welfare checks,
the money from the federal government. Okay, so when you hear these people going and they'll say, "Oh, it belongs," treaty lands, it belongs to it. Baloney.
No,
this is a democracy. Y'all get one vote apiece.
Yeah.
Nobody gets more. The fact that there were treaties signed, okay, that wasn't any good for our native population to begin with. I mean, you look at what's going on right now, it's a horrific affair, but the people are used to it. Most reserves you go on, the only rich people are the ruling class. Everybody else is in squalor. They don't have clean water. They're given everything, so they don't need to take care of it. So that's a whole problem that First Nations people have to deal with, right? Aside from all of this. But the fact of the matter is, we all get one vote. Why? Because it's not a racist system that we're talking about. It's a system that says all men are created equal. Now, if you have a problem with all men created equal, then you sign off as to who you really are. Now we know who you are.
Yeah.
Right?
And my
that you're
biggest
more
thing-
special than another human being when that bleeds the same red blood as you. Right?
And see, my problem, you mentioned that we're a democracy, and I've come to kind of dislike that term because I feel like
I get it, but that's what Canada is, right?
to an extent, yes, because the understanding of, for most people now, of democracy, they don't really understand that democracy is supposed to mean fair vote in a more broad sense. And in Canada, it's like, sure, we might be a democracy, except the West votes don't matter. So are we really?
Oh yeah,
Exactly.
It's because the majority rules, and the majority was decided in a formula where the East is the majority.
Yeah.
Unlike a republic, whereas you mentioned earlier with the electoral college and so on and so forth, where there is a not necessarily perfectly equal for land mass, but when it comes to the amount of people, you have equal representation across the board. And what's going to happen is that they try to equalize the power structure. So it's not a democracy.
No,
it's a republic. It's a totally different setup. But when we're talking about paths, Declaration of Independence from Canada by a 50+1 majority, then we open ourselves up to say Alberta needs a constitution, right? But that's statehood, not necessarily U.S. statehood, but becoming a state.
Yes.
Right. And that has to happen next. The Clarity Act is a ridiculous thing to go down. We completely disagree with it. We think it's a recipe for failure, and it is something that can be easily infiltrated. And people seem to think that's the only method out. It's not. No, that's not true. Now, if Canada were to create such a huff and puff that they would bring the military in or so on and so forth, Alberta could at that point in time also seek asylum from the U.S. There's a method.
Yeah.
We might even have something that's totally out of our hands, and we might get annexed.
Yeah.
That is also possible as well. But Alberta should act as an independent country at that point, an independent state.
Yes.
And understand. And people say, and here's where we would disagree with the independence folks. Okay, those are pathways.
Yes.
That are legitimate and viable pathways. The Clarity Act is not a legitimate pathway.
No.
Okay. So I'm sorry. And I know that people think that's the only way. And then they'll say, if you use any other way, that's a declaration of war. Well, that's a ridiculous statement. So I know there's a lot of that stuff going out there, people saying, well, and then people are just buying it for what it is. Oh, well, we don't want to have a declaration of war. Listen, you're already independent to begin. Okay. So did Alberta, after 1931 and the Statute of Westminster, was Alberta invited to vote itself into Confederation in Canada? Were any of the provinces at that point in time that were no longer part of the colony of Britain, did any of them were asked at that point? No. So guess what happened? They just carried on as if nothing ever happened. Why? Because it was in their interest to carry on that way. That's the whole point. So when you have those are legitimate pathways, getting our own constitution. We've worked on the basis of an Alberta constitution based on Republican style. What we're saying economically at this point, and this is where, you and I have had this conversation before, is economically for Alberta now to, and people go, wait, that old landlocked. Listen, if you have a country in the midst of everything, and they'll say, well, the UN says you have to have access to tidewater. The UN does not say you have to have unrestricted access. It says access.
Yes.
We have one pipeline. Boom. And what are you going to do? You're going to go to the UN now, the anti-oil people who can't stand Alberta and been trying to destroy it for years, to say, please stand up for us and let us have unequaled access to tidewaters? They're never going to do it. Canada will be mad as wet hornets. Do they need Alberta oil? Well, apparently they don't, because we're not even allowed to have pipelines east. They're just going to get their more oil from Saudi Arabia. So why would Canada want to deal with us, especially since we've declared independence from them at that point? You have a hostile nation at that point in time, right? And then you have the U.S. who's sitting down below, already paying $10 less a barrel, or that number, that's an average number, at $10 less a barrel, and we're going to have to try to negotiate terms with the U.S. Whereas we need to get trade deals and so on and so forth. You know what's going on now with trade, for Pete's sake. It's not an easy thing to do, first off.
No.
Being a Republic of Alberta, being the state of Alberta, means that we're an independent country. What we need to do at that point is, what's our economic union going to be? And you said that it maybe would last 2 years, and I think you're right. I think what would
last
happen
2
is,
years, I think, because
it would start to become problematic, and all of a sudden
Exactly.
people would say, okay, enough. And I think part of the independence people say, listen, let's get independence first, right? They keep putting the Clarity Act in, and that's where we say it's got to stop. But let's get independence first, and then we'll see. They have this dream about Alberta having unequal trade, or unlimited trade, rather, is what I meant to say, with the US and Canada, and that would make them rich. That's fairy tales. That's their opinion. It is not going to happen that way, simply because those countries have their own agendas. And Alberta is not favored to begin with, and it won't be favored at that point in time. But by becoming a state, what you have is, Alberta would likely be the richest, if not the second richest state in the entire union, because of its resource. A lot of people don't understand that, don't realize that. Overnight, we're talking about becoming the richest state in the union. US dollar, Second Amendment, made in Alberta healthcare,
no
that
state
we
tax.
can take it, no state tax. And President Trump is already saying that he's going to stop federal taxes for anybody under 200,000 USD.
Which is huge.
Which is huge. What's that? Like 300, 350 Canadian dollars,
400.
right? Almost 40. That's ridiculous, right? And what we're saying is, we don't need income tax at a provincial level. We don't need property tax at a provincial level. And people say, well, how do you pay for all those? Well, there is a user pay tax system that, if you can afford it, then you're saying, I'm going to pay the taxes because I can afford to do it. That is a much more fair system than if I say, I really don't want to do it. Why should I pay it if I'm not using it? Right? It doesn't even make any sense. So there is zero downside to Alberta becoming a 51st state. We immediately have unlimited free trade with 50 other states, and they, unlike Quebec, can't stop our pipelines. We can go to court because they don't want it running through this piece of land, and the farmer says no. That's fine. But overnight, people will get rich. Who's afraid of that, Mike? The people who are currently rich in Alberta, who like being at the top of the cherry on the cake, and they're not talking about we the people. These are the people that finance the rulers, the government of Alberta, and the big corporations and big farm and so on. Those are the people who don't like that, because they're not out there for we the people.
No.
And what we're saying in AB 51, it's about we the people, giving everybody, every man is created equal.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's really I could go on and on. I'm sure we're probably running out of time, if we haven't run out of time.
No, we're good on time.
We're good on time?
We're great on time.
Okay, well, if these things are pretty simple paths on how you get there. Do I know all of the little legalities that are going out there? Nobody does.
No.
And neither do they in the Clarity Act. But we can tell you that the Clarity Act is fraught with booby traps and pitfalls, and it's designed that way. And people got to just think for a second. Why would the government of Canada make it easy for someone to separate? The reason they had to allow separation is because they are independent provinces to begin with. They're sovereign to begin with. So they couldn't say they weren't sovereign. But what they wanted to do was they wanted to create a stumbling block for for the provinces so that they could control the outcome. And really, that's what we got to be really careful about here. When we looked at AB 51 project in the early years, when we looked at how many people in Alberta really were pro independence, it was massive. When we started polling people and explaining the advantages, Mike, we're talking 95% of people, even up to 98, okay, who are just saying, where do I sign up once they're educated? And that's the point of what AB 51 has to do. And what we want is for people to take that information and get it out there and share it. We're not a political organization, we're an education organization. And that's it. I have no aspirations for politics, don't like it, can't stand the whole idea behind it. But I do want we, the people, to be able to realize that there is another way to do this. And we believe a much better way. And so we talk about sentimentality in Canada and so on and so forth. Heck, the whole flag, its symbolism is a ridiculous thing. You have a maple leaf. You know the maple leaf doesn't grow out west, right? The sugar maple grows where? Well, to tip it, in central Canada to the east, okay? You have a red maple leaf that does not represent the country at all, okay? On a white background, separated with two blood red bars, Eastern blood and Western blood. Flags mean something. You might say, oh, that's ridiculous.
They do.
Flags mean something, and there is purpose behind the flag. Just as there's purpose behind the US flag, there's purpose behind the Canadian flag. And that Canadian flag was not to unify Canada, it was to glorify central Canada, the Leaf provinces, and it was to bleed the East and the West on either side. I know people, they didn't want to think about their country that way. No. They wanted to think it was all great and wonderful. We all did. We grew up. We wanted to say that Canada was the greatest nation on earth. The reality is, it was never true. And frankly, and they said, well, what about the U.S. and so on and so forth? Listen, the U.S. is going through the biggest cleanup in the history of any nation on the planet. Okay, and the reason that the left and the rulers of Canada don't like what's going on in the States and a guy like Donald Trump or Elon Musk with Doge is because they're scared to death that it would come here. Yeah. Because if it came here, it would show that we are even more corrupt than they are. And that's the reality. People need to wake up and smell the coffee. That's what's going on. Yeah. But we do have a way out. We do have a protector. Donald Trump now in the new administration has said, hey, we'll take you. That's interesting. Now, I had one person say, oh, well, the U.S. will just rape all of our resources. This kind of silly talk from people, that's just people's opinions. The fact of the matter is it can't happen because the design of a republic is to protect the states. Even the state is protected from another state doing that to them, let alone the federal government. Unlike Canada, and maybe that's what people are looking and they say, oh, well, Canada's doing it. The U.S. is bigger. They'll do it even worse. No. A republic is designed to protect the states. We would have our own constitution. Talk about First Nations. First Nations could have their own constitution. They could have their own judges, their own judiciary, their own police force, their own elected governor of their land. Okay, when it comes to First Nations in the States, they get 100% of the resources. I believe I'm told, someone may correct me, I believe in Canada, it's 3%.
Yes, roughly, give or take. Not a whole lot.
So why are people against this now? And when you see people, listen, the people get up on the TV and they start saying, this is indigenous lands. Listen, these are paid propagandists. They have not a clue what they're talking about, and they have an agenda. And I'll tell you what the agenda is. They're out to make a buck.
Yeah.
That's what it's all about.
And aside from
we're
that,
democracy,
too,
one vote per person.
And aside from that too, and I grew up around it, so all the indigenous here gonna hate me for this, but I don't care. I grew up around 3 different reserve areas. If you cared about your land, you wouldn't spend your time destroying everything that's given to you. Well, and continuing to take government money.
But look, that is like any family. When I was a kid, I had these little penguins, and I was really young, and we lived on the second floor. Mm-hmm. And my mom, I went to the window and I took the penguins and I dropped it out the second floor down on the street. And my mom said, "Don't you do that again. I'm not going to go get it for you." Right? So she went down and got it. So of course, hey, but you did go get it.
Yeah.
Let's try it again. Right? Threw it out. Now she's getting mad. I'm not going to go get it if I take. So she goes down. Hmm. So I'm looking at her. I'm looking out the window, looking at her, and going, just like a cat. I throw it out the window. She said, "That's it." And my penguins are gone. And I remember just being heartbroken because I had lost it all. When you just don't make people accountable for themselves and just give something, they don't understand the value. It's not the people that's the problem.
No.
It's the system.
And the system is designed to make
people
reliant on you.
Yes. And they want that way because you'll always look to them for the next, go get their penguin again. That's what that's what it's designed to do. And people think that there's some sort of freedom. You see, that's the horrible thing about it. The old saying is that you can, the welfare system gives a man a fish, but a conservative system teaches a man how to fish. Yeah. Makes them self-sufficient. Being self-sufficient and a master of my own destiny, I have nobody to blame but myself as to where I'm going, which is why I'm in Alberta. Yeah. Which is why you said you came out here. Yeah. That's why people come here. We have the most self-made millionaires of any province or state in North America because people come here and they see the freedom and they see the opportunity. Imagine having it in a republic where you would have hundreds of billions of dollars invested by the US in infrastructure alone in Alberta. Think of it. All the government buildings that would have to be built, the military installations, the investment in pipelines and infrastructure, and your house going from Canadian dollar to US dollar overnight. There is zero downside to this. And that's not what the independence people are selling. However, I hear them using the same verbiage, but they're acting as if you become a state of the union. You're not going to be a state of the union.
You're still an independent state.
You're an independent state. And
yes, in a broader sense.
You're left with...
In a broader sense, you're
in a physical, in a landmass state, but not economically.
Right.
And that's the problem, is that we want what's best for our people. This sentimentality that somehow and I think part of it, Mike, is the propagandists, paid propagandists by the federal government, have made people racist against Americans. Yes. In a sense of that we are superior somehow, morally, virtuously, whatever, superior to Americans, which is a ludicrous thing. Here's what I can tell you. The silent majority doesn't agree with that. No. But there are a lot of gullible people. Yeah. And what we saw with the whole elbows up campaign, I think I got to say to the Liberals, bravo, you ran the best PR campaign I've ever seen in my life. You made people like a dictator overnight. Mm-hmm. And these are all, like you said, they're psychological operations, right? Psyops. And the Canadians and Westerners that fall for that, listen, all that's going to go by the wayside eventually, because people are going to get bored with it, because it was a good rah-rah at the time, right? They're going to get bored about it. And then they're going to start to realize that inflation is through the roof and you can't buy a bag of groceries for under $200, and that you can't get a job. It's already a thing. And what if I could say that overnight your taxes would drop 60% to what they are, if not more? Healthcare, we would have Alberta healthcare. We would be able to create a healthcare system that was superior to any in North America, right? And we would run it out of Alberta. What do we got to do? Get the corruption out of it. Get the government out of it.
Yeah.
Because as soon as you get the government's hands in it, it becomes corrupt. Get corporations out of it.
Well, the last minister of or health minister we had in Alberta, her name escapes me now because I've already forgotten about her. I think she moved
Dina
into
Hinshaw,
that's the one.
Brooke.
Yes,
Nice.
and we noticed, and the healthcare system here is still broken because there's still government involvement in it. But as soon as she left, there was less strain, slightly. There's still a lot of strain, but there was less in a slightly noticeable sense that, well, we took one piece of corruption out, so it's like almost clogging, like opening up a traffic jam where you get the main one causing it. There's still a bit of a jam, but things are starting to move. It's still very slow.
Yeah.
And I think that perfectly describes the wait times people are facing. But it's moving.
It's a Canadian system. And if you talk to people across Canada, they all say the same thing. People are dying in waiting rooms. It's not unheard of at all, right? People say, well, what about American healthcare? And I'd like to maybe address that a little bit. There's so much propaganda on this. It's a ridiculous situation. In the U.S., you have Medicare and Medicaid for people. You can go in and say, I can't afford it. They can't refuse you. You have Medicare and Medicaid. Would we stop at that in Alberta? Of course not. We're Albertans. We expect more than that. Yeah. Okay. If you take $600 billion in I think it's $750 billion now, in equalization payments since 1954, we'd have a heck of if you just apply that. And there's so many other ways to finance this properly. Once you get the corruption out, the corruption is meant to pay off people. That's got to stop.
Yes.
We have to have a Doge mechanism to be able to stop that. And when you look at we the people and get out of the government running things, then we the people will demand it. When we start to understand that we have the power, it's like that cartoon, that pixel cartoon or whatnot, the Bug's Life, I think it was, where the grasshoppers had been tormenting all the ants for so long and ruling over them, and the big ruler of the grasshoppers says to one of his minions, he says, if they realize there's more of them than there is of us, it's all over, right?
Yeah.
The people need to govern themselves. They don't need a ruler.
Yeah.
Let's get rid of the divine right of kings and divine right of rulership. And you know what? They all think, you say, well, we're not in a monarchy. We don't have a king. Listen,
we do.
The government of Canada is set up as a supreme rulership. So they changed the name. It's just lipstick on the pig. It's still a pig.
Yeah.
Okay. That's always been the situation with that kind of stuff. We need to empower the people. We need to give them hope. We need to have them realize the hardest thing we have as people when we're trying to explain it to them is to allow them to visualize, because they've never been in the system. And this is why I say Eastern Canada, because what freedoms have you lost? They've lost so many of them, they don't even realize anymore. So what we have is we need to really, how do I get people to understand that there's a better way, that you would have so much more freedom, so much more disposable income, so much more hope, and for the future. The 51st state that's what is offered.
That's the answer.
That's the answer. Independence doesn't do that. There's a lot of hope there. There's a lot of, I hope it works out. What we're saying is exactly, this is a guaranteed way of doing it. Here's the second thing I'm going to say. Inevitably, all of North America will become part of the US. It will be North America. Okay. That's a reality. I know people say, oh, I don't like that, and you can't force it. No, it's just going to happen.
Yeah.
It's just because geopolitically and geoeconomically, there's no choice. Canada is a small player on it. And really, our biggest client is the US. And
Yep.
we're the smallest vendor to them. And when I say the smallest vendor, it's because they can go worldwide. They're doing trade agreements now worldwide.
Not with us.
Trump is right. They don't need our wood. They don't need our manufacturing. They have it all. So if they take it, if they say just ramp up, and how is Trump being like anti-Canada in this? He's not. He's not there. And this is what he talks about, subsidizing Canada. And I laugh at the reactions. Well, we're subsidizing Canada to the tune of $200 billion a year. He says, you got to understand that what he's saying is, I can ramp up my production here. I create jobs in manufacturing here, and I'm not giving it to you because I don't need to give it to you.
Yeah.
If I have to add on hundreds of thousands of feet onto my manufacturing plant so that I can take it from you, it's to my advantage. Why? They pay taxes here, so on and so forth. He's even got a plan now to write off your car payments on your income tax. That's crazy.
But
To give
love it.
people, of course they, and I mean, you're sitting there
It's
going,
one less expense.
absolutely. I'm not talking against it. I think it's a wonderful idea. What's he doing? He's standing up for his people. Meanwhile, we're used to a government that says, how much more can I get from you?
Yeah.
How much more sweat, blood, and tears can I get off your back so that I can enrich myself and send it around the world and launder it so it goes into my account? So like Trudeau, he can live off in some Caribbean somewhere and got millions, and who knows how much he actually has. You know what I'm saying? So who knows what he actually has? And all he's done is 9 years of tyranny.
Mhm.
Right.
And this is where I even think, and I said it in a previous video, because even our premier, and Danielle, we have our differences, and there's things I agree with, things I don't.
Yeah.
But she said in a press conference a couple of months ago, I got a mandate to make Canada work. No, you didn't.
No,
No,
you never did.
You are a provincial leader.
Yeah.
And you saying you got a mandate to make Canada work just tells me that you're part of Team Canada and not part of Team Alberta. Because being elected provincially, or, in the future, being elected as the state governor, you have a mandate to your state, to your nation, not to the rest of the country. You have a mandate to make your own state or province work. That's it.
Politicians generally follow the wind. It's blowing this way. So, we'll see where it all ends up. You and I've discussed that. Look, Alberta's conservative, and the UCP are the only conservative game in town at this point in time. But be careful. May not always be the case. Is she doing a great job? I think on so many levels, she's doing a fantastic job. And like you said, I don't agree with her on everything either. But I think the majority of the people like the change because they had the Kenny, who was the biggest, politician. And I want to be nice. Okay. So, Kenny came in.
Jason has got one thing. His line in the sand was oil and gas. And when they axed the last pipeline deal, that was it for him. He had nothing else.
I think we're digressing on this point, but Kenny didn't turn out to be what he started out to be. Let's put it that way. But frankly, the people need to speak up because government responds to the people. They respond to the votes. That's really what's going on. And so what I would say to the people is educate yourself. Go to our site, ab51project.com. Go to that site, read it through. volunteer, to spread that information and make sure that we hold the leaders accountable in this independence movement. I see this independence movement, as I said, inevitable. My concern is who's going to lead it and who's going to take it over. Do they have the best wishes of the people? Are they infiltrators? And like all statehood people have said, and we've been ringing the warning bell on this, is the Clarity Act is not the method to do this. They're going to take you down a path. They're going to lead you down a garden path, and it's never going to happen. It'll be Quebec 2.0. So if you're a serious independence, become a state, because statehood is a guaranteed way. There will be no negotiating with Canada, where we realize that we are sovereign, and referendum will prove that.
Yeah. And now that we're kind of coming to the end here, I want to remind people, I'm going to put that link in the description. If you're worried about the government finding out that you're going to this website for any reason, there's also a link in the description to NordVPN to give you 3 months free on me. So go do that, sign up for Nord, and go check out Alberta 51 project, because this is the answer to Alberta's freedom in the future. Paul, thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much.
It was a great chat.
Coming down, yes.
We're definitely going to have another episode, I think, to talk about the difference in the systems.
Yeah.
Because that's going to have to happen.
Yeah.
Sure. But that, I think, has to happen once we're in that state position.
Yeah.
All right.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Canadians, and if anyone else wants to have take a sober look at yourself right now, you need to leave Canada. Canada is not what you thought it was. Canada is a Marxist hellhole. And by the way, Alberta, the rest of Canada despises you. Americans won't. Yeah. Americans will welcome you with open arms. This isn't just trolling. It's not 51st state and you're subservient. It's territory or a state, and you now have access to the world, and your people can flourish.